All right. Good evening. It's so exciting. There's about 27 of you currently on here, and we had about 45 people signed up. So I'm sure we'll hear lots of chiming in as the night goes on. Carol and I are co-hosting this collaboration strand for the entire year. So some nights you'll see Carol and some nights you'll see me. So we only have about an hour and a half together. So we are going to kind of jump right in and get started tonight. Hopefully you guys can all turn on your video and be ready to engage since this is a collaboration session. All right, so our agenda tonight is really focusing on just getting to know each other. So we'll do a quick welcome activity and a self-assessment. And we're going to do some pre-session discussions of some of the work you guys did for your homework. And then we'll get right into the main teaching and learning for tonight. And then we have a bulk of time where you guys will be able to take action and get right into the work that we are here to do tonight, which is build standards walls and focus on learning targets. And then we just have a little bit of closing business at the end of the night. So if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat or chime in if you feel like it's a great whole group question. So we have a huge job and we are so thrilled that everybody signed up to be a part of this accelerated learning project. This picture I love because it signifies how expansive and ongoing this work is we have together and how deep and very challenging it can be. So let's have fun, let's collaborate, and hopefully we can lift each other up along the way. A couple of things you might need to access tonight in terms of just business. The navigation guide is going to be one link that we kind of always get back to. So I know Carol will put that in the chat, and hopefully you guys all have had a chance to look through that before tonight. And then again, feel free to jump in if there's any techie glitches or if I make any mistakes, please call me out on them. So our first task, which one of these pictures doesn't belong? And I realize on my screen, it's showing a little bit blurry. So just do your very best. I'm not sure why it's so blurry, but just do your best to figure out which one of these doesn't belong. And you can type the number of the picture that doesn't belong in the chat. I'm going to give you guys about 1 minute to come up with a reasoning behind your answer, and then we'll have a couple of you explain. All right. Since it's always super hard to call out people on Zoom, I would love a couple brave volunteers. If we can have 2 people share their reasoning of which picture they chose and why.
Okay, I'll share.
Thank you.
I chose number 4 because it was the one that didn't belong because it had a person in it.
Oh, very cool. Was that Andrea?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And one more brave soul to share which picture doesn't belong and why.
I chose 3 because it was the only one that was inside.
Oh, fascinating. Was that Julie?
Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. Awesome. Well, so in this picture, you guys could have defended any one of these pictures. But more or less, I just want you to be putting that thinking cap on and really that reasoning cap for tonight. All right, a couple housekeeping norms we have to get us started. We are all here to model by example. We are all here to spend time on task and really encouraging talk from everybody. So kind of share the airtime. I know some of the parts I'll be leading, and then some of the work you guys are going to be doing in small group out in our breakout sessions. So I'm encouraging everyone to participate and help kind of lift each other up. Again, if you guys have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Angie Godfrey is also on here, and she said she can help with the chat as well. If you have questions, You guys are welcome to email us at any point and check out the website as well, because that was full of tons of information and all of the pre-session work as well. Is there any like dying questions that anybody has at the moment before we jump in? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask. All right, so the first thing we are going to have you guys get started with is this self-assessment. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to complete this self-assessment. It is linked in the navigation guide, as well as Carol, I think we'll put it in the chat. This self-assessment is for you. We are here to guide you through this accelerated learning process, and we want to share a lot of tools to make your job more successful, but we want to know, where is your mindset? And this picture that says impossible to possible. So how often have you said those words to yourself and then made something magical happen, or did something that you didn't think you could do or tackle in your classroom? So we are going to revisit this self-assessment later on this year, but we want to start off the year with just this quick self-assessment. And again, this is for you. Carol and I may check in on it if you are doing part of the coaching strand. It could be one of our topics that we chat with you about. But for right now, let's go ahead and take 5 minutes and work through this self-assessment, and then we will move on to our next task. All right, hopefully you guys have all had a chance to work through kind of those 3 main pieces that we're going to focus on, of really the growth mindset, the accelerated learning framework, which is the bulk of our learning, as well as the community of practice. So those are, again, this self-assessment is really for you, and it's for you to be able to get a gauge of the never to always range. So hopefully you can use this as an opportunity to reflect, kind of set some of those mini goals for you as we move through this process together. All right. So we are going to jump into our pre-session discussion. Part of your pre-session work is really to kind of get you more familiar with our standards walls, as well as you guys had a podcast, chapter 2, I believe, from the book, and then another article that talked about some essential learning. And you could have picked either one of those to do as part of your pre-session work. So in just a minute, I'm going to assign you guys to a breakout room. Please go ahead and pick a timekeeper, because you will only have about 10 minutes. In this 10-minute time frame, if you guys could do a quick introduction of who you are and maybe what grade level you work in. And then these 3 questions. What big ideas stand out to you from any of your pre-session learning? It could be from any of the pieces. What challenges are presented, maybe challenges for you specifically. And then if and what questions do you have so far? And maybe people in your group could also have those questions, or could help you solve some of those questions. All right, it looks like we are all back into the main room. Sorry for the confusion on breakout room 1. That was totally my fault. I thought the main room was breakout room 1. So glad we got that clarified for the next collaboration sessions. I just really want to quickly share out a couple big ideas that you guys kind of took away from either the pre-session slide deck, or an article, or a podcast, or maybe something fascinating that you and your group talked about before we kind of get into the teaching and instruction strand. So do we have anyone from breakout room 1 that wants to share out a big idea?
I'll share. Most of our discussion was around, since breakout room 1 was mostly pre-readers, figuring out a way to make it so a standards wall or something like that is applicable. How to get something up there that's applicable to kids who can't read, because we don't want to waste the wall space for stuff that there's no reason for them, that they can't utilize.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a really good big idea. Does anyone else from breakout room 2 want to share a big idea or even a challenge?
I was in breakout room 2, and we mainly discussed logistical concerns like where do we put this? What would it look like? Um, what would the size be? How would we incorporate this into our classroom in a practical way?
Awesome. Thanks, Melanie. Would anyone from breakout, we'll just do one more. So let's do breakout room 3. Any big ideas or challenges that you guys discussed? Any brave souls from breakout room 3?
I can share.
Thanks.
So we just talked about the challenge of not having space to write the standards and objectives on the board. And there were a lot of really good ideas about how to display those. We had one teacher who doesn't have her own room, and so she has to take those to 3 separate classrooms and try to keep them up the whole time. So lots of challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. We're going to try to tackle and maybe touch on some of those challenges that you guys brought up, as well as some of those big ideas. So let's go ahead and jump into the teaching and learning piece of our evening. So the focus, or really the learning focus, is building a standards wall. And we have 2 tasks to kind of navigate that. The first task is actually building the standards wall. And we have scaffolded this because some of you guys may have done a lot of work already kind of unpacking standards, and some of you guys with your team or your buildings may have not. So we're going to kind of review both tasks in tandem. And then during our work time tonight, you will be able to choose which task is better for your exact current situation with your team, or maybe you're working solo and you're partnering up with someone else in your breakout room. So the first task is building a standards wall. You're going to jump into this task if you have kind of already highlighted your priority standards for your unit, or you already have a good idea of your learning targets for this unit. I know some schools are kind of wrapping up their first unit and they're ready to dive into unit 2. And if that's about where you are, then tonight's a perfect night to really jump into unit 2 and figure out what are those big ideas. The second task we have is unpacking a standards template. And this is kind of really about naming your high priority standard for your unit, and then focusing on what are some of those learning targets or skills that students need to achieve that target. So the first one we're going to look at is the standards wall. So that was what you guys focused on mostly in your pre-session. This is where you're summarizing the unit goal. You're kind of placing it potentially in the center of some kind of visual display for your students. And then however you want to organize your paths or your channels, those are your learning targets and kind of your progressions of how you will achieve that standard. An important part of building the standards wall is pulling out that academic vocabulary that you guys could use for your tip chart, which hopefully you kind of read a little bit about, but that's a really essential piece of kind of building this standards wall. So we're just going to look through a couple of the examples. And this one I really like because it's super precise. It's not overdone. This is really just identifying that priority standard and then what verbs or words that had to do with this standard. This visual is great. It doesn't take up a lot of wall space. I also believe I found this one and it's outside. It's actually in the hallway, which isn't necessarily like kids can't read it all the time when they're in your class. But for some of you guys that were talking about space, you can kind of think about where else do you have space. I've seen a couple teachers also do this on chart paper, and it's just like a normal piece of chart paper, and it's just hanging right below their whiteboard, and they kind of move it up on their whiteboard during that class. And if you have multiple classes or multiple grade levels, you can kind of change out those standards wall posters as you go throughout. This one is much larger. This one actually came from like a full-size bulletin board. I like this one because it's a little bit more concrete in terms of informal arguments to explain angle properties. So their verbs here, they're talking about 2 different types of uses, lots of describing, 2 different types of understanding, and then verifying. So again, this is just another example. If you had a lot of space, which I know most of you do not have a lot of space. So Carol and I had mentioned quite a few times about making a digital copy of a standards wall. And maybe for your math lesson, whenever your math block is, you could just display this if you weren't using your projector for something else, or if you could kind of have it on another screen. A digital copy would be a really convenient use of building a standards wall. And then this one is kind of more about modeling. So this goes back to that kinder and first grade question. You can see all their different fraction pieces are up on the board. And I would encourage kind of all of those non-literate grades to be thinking about what pictures, what's the end target for all of those standards, because all students, regardless if they're kinder or all the way up to high school, it's really nice to have that visual. What should the end product look like? But kinder specifically, you can be thinking about maybe building your standards walls with picture examples.
Andy,
This-
I wanted to go back, sorry, really quickly on
Go
the
ahead.
digital copy. One bonus about that would be if you're using Google Classroom, that could be right there in your Google Classroom for students to refer to at home as well. So,
Yes. And I know people mentioned like Google Slides would be a really awesome option to kind of start that with. Again, these things can kind of be modified so that you're always working or maybe always building on them. Even having them from year to year would be really helpful. Also, I know a couple schools already said, hey, we have the same curriculum. Can we just divvy up the work and share, which is awesome. So hopefully you can, if you don't have a teammate on your team here tonight, maybe you can find someone else with your grade level to kind of dig into this. All right, I also realized this is super blurry, so I apologize about this, but we just also wanted to make the connection of when you're building your standards walls, connecting that to the standards of math practice. Obviously, all of our students should be focusing on the standards of math practice and us using those academic or all of the academic language. So you could kind of be thinking about how do these apply to my unit, or maybe which one of these shows up in some of my learning targets for certain lessons. All right, the second task tonight is really unpacking the standard. So this part is identifying a priority standard, or maybe it's multiple priority standards, figuring out which nouns and verbs are in that. So do they need to describe? Do they need to identify? What do they need to be able to do and know? And then how are those learning targets working towards your standard? So they call it the learning ladder in this template. There's an example template in the navigation guide, as well as like a blank template that you could fill out tonight as well. And unpacking the standards chart just kind of helps you figure out what are your overarching learning targets. So this might be a really nice place to start. If you're feeling like you're not ready to quite jump into the standards wall, you could focus on what are my learning targets for the standards in my unit. And that looks a little bit like, so these are the 2 exemplars that I have in the navigation guide as well. So as you can see, this is a 7th grade. This is a 7th grade example. This is focused. They kind of filled in the timeline here. It's like a unit 4. They picked out the main priority standard, and then they went down to 6th grade. Oh no, they went down. Sorry about that. They went down to 6th grade in some of the coherence maps and thinking about what was the prior connection standard. And then they're also thinking vertically. So what comes after this standard? So what's super important that 7th graders need to be able to do? What were they supposed to be able to do in 6th grade to get them there? So really thinking about that vertical planning. They picked out like all of the nouns that come from that standard. So ratios, equivalent ratios, proportional relationships. And then they also picked out all of the skills. So what are the verbs with the nouns? What do students actually need to be able to do? The academic language piece is really nice because that relates directly to our tip chart. Pulling out all of those pieces and maybe just focusing, hey, I have 1 month and I really need to make sure that we are constantly focusing on these 8 vocab words. So you could be doing, pictures, definitions, all of those things that so students have an exact reference and they're not using a ton of brain power to kind of look for those all the time. They're just kind of up and visual to students all the time. So the big piece of this unpacking the standards template is really this bottom part, kind of the learning ladder. So this is where you're thinking, what could students who already know this, how can I push them? So this is like the extension piece, the higher part of the ladder. Then you have the middle column or the middle row, I should say, which is like the grade level standard. So these 3 different parts, they're really breaking all of it down. And then they're going to the bottom of the ladder, which is the prior knowledge standards. And these might be coming from, as you can see, one of them comes all the way from 4th grade and then 2 from 6th grade. So this is where we're coming into like, my students cannot tackle this standard right now. So where can I supplement? Where can I think about all of those prerequisite skills? And then the second page is really kind of that exemplar, like where does this standard show up and what is it going to look like maybe at the end of the unit when they have mastered this skill? So this is kind of the overview. Like I said, this is a 7th grade example that really kind of dives in for teachers who are feeling like, I need a little bit more help on just focusing on what does my standard actually mean and what are all those learning targets that go with that standard. Is there any questions specifically on this exemplar that anyone wants to ask? No? Okay. Feel free to type it in the chat as well. Because I want to keep our time. I'm very timely, so I want to give you guys as much work time as possible. So you are in kind of the taking action part of the evening. So this is where you get to pick one of the tasks. You're either going to jump in and get building those standards walls. Like I said, you could be thinking about it digitally right now. You could do it on scratch paper. I know a lot of you like emailed or reached out about like, hey, should I bring my next unit or my current unit? And I encourage most of you guys to bring your next unit so that you can be kind of thinking of that big picture. The second task, you have the option to work through that unpacking the standards template, which is really just naming your high priority standards and coming up with that learning ladder and all of those skills that kind of just go with that template. I encourage you to work and collaborate with your breakout room. I know some of you guys brought some of your teammates, and Carol and I will be kind of jumping around as well, asking questions along the way. So if you feel confident and you're ready to jump into your breakout room that you are in and pick a task, we are going to meet back in here in the main breakout room at 6:25. We just have a couple minutes of closing business, and then I'll stay here in the main room for 5 to 10 minutes as well, if some of you guys want to stay and ask one-on-one questions as well before you jump to your breakout room. So hopefully you're feeling ready to get started on one of those tasks. All of the templates and lots of links and resources are on the navigation guide. I included like all of the content standards that also have kind of the progressions. The Achieve the Core has all of the priority standards that kind of can help you focus in by grade level of which ones you could be really focusing on. And then at the bottom of the navigation guide in the resource section, I have both templates. So I have the example from the slideshow as well as a blank template for you. So if you don't have any other questions at the moment, I'll have you guys jump to your breakout rooms and go ahead and get started on one of those tasks. And I'll see you at 6:25. If you want to stay and ask me more questions, please do so.